trying to put those terms with the right places. Okay. So here in the propulsion, like I said, there's swallowing, and they said that's called deglutition, right? Peristalsis. And they say peristalsis in small and large intestine. I told you in the small intestine that's called segmental waves. In the large intestine that's called mass movements. Other than that, it's just trying to show you where the different processes occur. In case you can't understand what wave-like contractions are, they show you a picture. Okay? So this would be like what would happen in the esophagus when you swallow. Okay? If this part contracts, pushes the food down, and just that keeps happening until you get to the stomach. Is that conceptually pretty easy to understand? Okay. I'm going to skip over the regulatory mechanisms right now because we're going to go into a lot of detail about that. So let me give you a little preview of what to think about for the essays for this section. Typically, you get your choice of one of two. One of them is quite long, and that is catalog for me the digestive secretions and what they do. Okay? So in this one, you have to tell me all the different regions, like the oral cavity, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and the accessory glands, so salivary glands, liver, pancreas. You have to tell me what chemicals they secrete in those areas, and then tell me what they do. Now, conceptually, this is not too tough. This is basically just a list, okay? It's long. There's a lot of stuff that goes in that list, okay? But it's, like I said, conceptually not too rough, okay? Plus, when you do that one, once you define what a chemical does, you don't have to tell me again if it's redundant. So for instance, mucus is produced in every organ. Once you tell me that mucus is for liquefying and lubricating the food as it moves through, you don't have to tell me every single time what mucus does, okay? Just list mucus. Don't tell me again what it does. Likewise with lipase and amylase. There's a couple places we produce those enzymes. So once you tell me that lipase breaks down triglycerides and you tell me that amylase breaks down polysaccharides, don't tell me that again.
But you want to know the enzymes and where they're located?
Yes. Yeah. So you gotta have the regions, and in each region you gotta tell me what's secreted and what it does. Okay? So like I said, that's fairly long, but your book has, I think, 2 tables in it where it does almost exactly all of that. So it's really just kind of memorization. The other one is a lot less writing, but is conceptually a little bit more advanced. And the other one is regulatory mechanisms of digestive secretions. Okay? How are digestive secretions regulated? It's more complicated, but a lot less writing. Okay? We're going to deal with reflexive hormonal mechanisms, and we're going to deal, reflexive autonomic mechanisms, nervous, okay, reflexive autonomic mechanisms, and also hormonal mechanisms. Okay? And both of those are going to influence the production of, say, saliva, which I kind of already mentioned, parasympathetic stimulation of the salivary glands. And then mostly the focus is going to be on how do we regulate stomach secretion and intestinal secretion. Okay, that's what I'm really going to be interested in. So just, you got those down there, so now you know as I'm lecturing, kind of listen to those two. Okay? I'm going to go through bit by bit, and so what you're going to have to do is over the 2 lectures, you're going to have to compile that list. Like I said, you can copy it out of the book, or you can go condense it down from the notes. I'm not going to go point by point. I'm going to do it as I go through the different regions of the small intestine, so you kind of have to assemble that. The other one, the regulatory mechanisms, I'll probably be a little bit more concise with that. We'll talk about that all together. Okay? So those are the 2 essays you get to choose from, and those are the only essays from this chapter. So really, let's see, your test should have, as far as I know, just 2 sets of essays. It's got the hemostasis, platelet plug or clotting, and then these 2.
Only 2?
Only 2.
Are you still going to post those online?
So
They're already on.
Then more MCQ, right?
They're more,
And then the test?
what about? There's more multiple choice?
No, more multiple choice then?
I don't know.
2 estimates, 10.
Well, it
10,
just
20?
means, yeah, they're probably going to be 10 points each.
Okay, so 20 and then
80.
80.
All right, so I'm gonna skip the regulatory mechanisms right now, okay? And I'm gonna come back and talk about those later. So now we're gonna just review a few things from A&P 1. Things that you should have already learned when you learned body cavities and the membranes, but we're gonna revisit it. You know that all the organs that are in pretty much your body that you learn about are all in what we call the ventral cavity, right? Okay. The ventral cavity, right here, the diaphragm is split to the thorax above and the abdominal pelvic cavity below. Stop me if I say anything you don't remember. These body cavities are lined with membranes called serous membranes because they secrete this proteoglycan fluid that's very, very slippery, and that's the function of serous fluid, is to lubricate. Okay? The membranes that line the abdominal pelvic cavity, well, the one that lines the entire abdominal pelvic cavity is called the parietal peritoneum. Right? Parietal peritoneum. That's the one that lines the whole cavity. So it's up against the body wall. So if you dissected through the abdomen, of course, you have to get through the skin and the musculature, and you were to open up the abdomen, you'd see a lot of fatty mesentery in there. We'll talk about mesentery a little bit later. But you can actually scoop most of the intestines out, put them in a little tray off here to the side, and you see a glistening cavity in there, okay? That looked like it had shrink wrap along the back body wall. That would be the parietal peritoneum that you'd be looking at, okay? Put all the guts back in, the surface of the viscera in there would be covered with another membrane, and that would be the visceral peritoneum, okay? So the visceral peritoneum is the membrane that lays over the surface of the organs, okay? And the parietal peritoneum is the membrane that lines the cavity.
That's kind of how the heart layers were.
Yeah, right. Difference being here, we don't have a fibrous layer. They're both serous membranes. Now in the abdomen, we pull a different kind of trick. Okay? In the abdomen, we do something unique. We take some of the parietal peritoneum, and we take some of the visceral peritoneum, and we pull some of the visceral peritoneum off of the organ, and we pull some of the parietal peritoneum off of the body wall, and we tie it together, and we make a cord in the middle, and we call that cord mesentery. Okay. Mesentery is a serous membrane made out of both visceral and parietal peritoneum. It's a double-layered serous membrane called mesentery, M-E-S-S-E-N-T-A-R-Y. E-R-Y. Dang, I always do that. You think I'd learn? Thank you. All right. Mesentery.
And that's made of visceral and parietal?
Uh-huh. It's where the two run together. And the job of mesentery is to hold the abdominal organs in place. The job of mesentery is to hold abdominal organs in place. And in lab, I'll show you a few pictures of some mesentery. I'll show you some mesentery proper, and I'll show you the greater omentum.
So, mesentery peritoneum is where those two connect and it holds organs in place.
Yeah, and here, I think you've got a picture. There you go. It's a little diagrammatic, but it kind of gets to the point. Here, if we took a section through the abdomen and looked at it, all right, here's the dorsal, there's your vertebral column. So you're coming anteriorly right here. This might be a tube of the small intestine or something like that. Out here lining the cavity, there's your parietal peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum lines the organ. And then here, the two connect, they form, it's not like one runs into the other, but they actually form a double membrane. Okay? That's where you'd have mesentery. And they're just calling it dorsal and ventral mesentery. I don't care that you know that. Just know the function of mesentery. Okay? It's got two layers of serous membrane with a little bit of connective tissue in the middle. Okay? And it holds things like nerves and blood vessels. So if you dissect out the abdomen, you'd see it kind of pulsating with this purple and red kind of ooey sort of pulsing feeling to it. And those would be blood vessels running through the mesentery, supplying blood or taking blood away from the abdominal viscera. Go ahead.
So are these peritoneum set up like the pericardium, like the parietal and visceral pericardium?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And the difference, like Tira mentioned this, the difference is that there's no fibrous layer to the parietal peritoneum. It's see-through. It's just serous. Okay. But yeah, it's the same basic layering.
It says 2 layers of serous membrane with what in between?
A little bit of connective tissue. That's what in mesentery. And it houses blood vessels and nerves. So remember, the function of mesentery is to organize the bowel, to hold it in place. Okay? Could you imagine what the bowels would be like if it didn't have anything to hold it in place? You'd have nearly 30 feet of tubes that were convulsing in there, all right? They would just tie themselves in knots over time. They would just wrap around each other, and so the mesentery prevents it from doing that, okay? It holds it in place, so this one can convulse a little bit, but it can't go loop in through another one and make a big mess like that. Holds the bowels in place. When we get to the immunity chapter, we're going to learn another function of mesentery, and that is that, remember that connective tissue I said in the middle? It's there. Well, it's mostly loose connective tissue, and it provides a pathway for monocytes and macrophages to literally crawl through. Okay? So it's kind of a super highway for immune cells to be able to travel through. Something called the reticuloendothelial system. And it's just, as you can imagine, your bowels probably have a lot of things like viruses and bacteria and stuff like that. So this is a hotbed for macrophage activity. In order to get from one area to another area really quickly, they don't have to go through the blood, they just cross through the connective tissues in the mesentery. Like I said, if you followed that, great. I'm not going to ask anything about that now. So for now, mesentery, double membrane, bless you, partly parietal, partly visceral, comes together and holds the bowels in place. Okay? Since we talked about it so much, why don't I show you? It's here in your brains right now.